if you're a strength coach, this shit that I'm about to talk about is very important. And most fighters have to be their own strength coach. And just because of economics. And a lot of fighters might be in the situation where you might be better off being your own strength coach rather than working with that guy for free that's coming in from another sport trying to build a reputation. In auxiliary athletic strength training well, I could leave it there, but especially for fighting, for combat sports, but just in auxiliary strength training, the biggest mistakes that are made, whether it's by the strength coach or other coaches or the athlete, is program design and exercise selection. And obviously there's going to be more videos, and I'm going to need to do a series on specific exercises and, thumbs up, thumbs down, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. We're not getting into that today. Today, what I want to talk about is understanding the spectrum of the paradigms of strength. And even the jargon within the athletic community, the strength training community, is not consistent and not congruent, so there's a lot of miscommunication and confusion. So, for our purposes, we're going to do the abridged version, the Cliff Note versions of this spectrum, and it's the spectrum of the paradigms of strength. So, in English, what does that mean? Strength expresses itself in different ways, in many forms, but it pretty much falls on the spectrum on the low end of low contractile force or low force and low velocity, all the way up to high force and or high velocity. And from the outside observer, force and velocity are different, but the mechanisms for producing high force or high velocity is activation capacity of motor units. It's the same. So it expresses itself different depending on mechanical variables and resistance or resistances or resistance profiles. But the neurological production of a high force movement or a high velocity movement or a high force velocity movement is the same. It's about activation capacity. This is important. So it's going to be a long video. Digest it in chunks if you have to. It's well worth your time. If you're a strength coach, if you're an aspiring strength coach, if you're a personal trainer, if you are a fighter, if you're an athlete, or if you're a nerd, this is worth it. So, the spectrum of the paradigms of strength is a fundamental key to understanding what is called athletic transference. So, in lay terms, transference simply means, does the exercise make the athlete perform better at the sport? And when it comes to performance or athletic transference, it's important to remember some axioms. The paradigms of strength are primarily where most of the benefit is to be found and where most transfer occurs, which is why I'm talking about the spectrum of the paradigms of strength. And it's a fundamental key to transference. skill does not transfer. So what does that mean? Well, if we take it to an extreme that makes it absurd, you can have the best tennis serve in the world. It's not going to increase your straight cross. It's not going to transfer to fighting, right? You can be the best wrestler in the world, doesn't mean you can box. Okay, so skill does not transfer, and the more specific you get, the more true that becomes. Skill does not transfer, and the broader you look at it, the more sense it makes, but the more specifically you look at it, the more nuanced you look at it, it still holds true. And that brings us to the overarching fundamental principle of all training, the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demand, SAID. Specificity. Specificity is king. So, because of specificity, skill cannot transfer. Today, we are going to be focusing on the paradigms of strength and exercise selection. We are going to separate it, just for now, from fuel systems and energy systems and energy production. What do I mean by that? We're not going to talk about cardio. We're not going to talk about ATP, CP. We're not going to talk about lactic thresholds. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff today. It's important, but it makes what I'm talking about exponentially more confusing. So let's just focus on the paradigm of strength and transference and exercise selection. There is confusion in the industry, in athletics, globally, but especially in combat sports. There is confusion in program selection, program design, exercise selection. Because not only are the sciences under the foundational sciences required to be competent at this stuff complex and vast. Each individual science you could spend a lifetime of studying and still not really have a handle on it. So there's that. And then within the industry itself, there's attempts to correct and progress. All right, so there's this meme out there that says train movement, not muscle. So before I attack this meme and take it apart and show you that it's doublespeak and really just nonsense, before I do that, I'm actually going to go back in time with you and maybe help shed some light on where it came from, what its intention was, and how it's actually helped. Even though it's totally fucking stupid and completely wrong and ass backwards. So, this meme of train movement, not muscle, it came out of a time back in my day. I'll tell you what, Sonny. In some ways, things used to be a lot worse. Things are pretty bad right now, as far as just like the amount of bullshit that is just perpetually dropped on people, just because of the access through social media and YouTube. And anyway, so there's more information being sloshed around, and there's a larger percentage of that information that is just wrong. It's fraudulent. It's incompetent, and it is marketing based. The purpose of a lot of these things is to make money, not improve performance. And then, with fucking Instagram, anyone can be a trainer just as long as they do the right drugs and get the right surgeries. There's a lot more people working out, a lot more people doing strength training, and I think as a whole, that's a good thing. But back in the 1980s and 1990s, when you walked into a gym, it was basically segregated and you were relegated into the worlds of bodybuilding or aerobics, which just the name aerobics is just so stupid. The group fitness classes back then were this it's kind of like jazz dance, jazzercise meets, I don't even know, but it was pretty bad. And women were afraid to lift weights back then because there was this belief that if you lifted weights, you got muscular, and I don't want to look, they didn't want to look masculine. So basically, it was, okay, men go over here and do bodybuilding, and women go over there and do step dance, aerobics. And the injury rates were incredibly high in the group fitness because the education was so lacking. And the injury rates with bodybuilding were also high. They just showed up 10 years later in surgeries, joint replacement and rotator cuff tears. And anyway, so if we look at it from that perspective back then, that you were either doing bodybuilding or cardio. That was it. That was the extent of the industry's understanding. Bodybuilding back then, like Arnold's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding was like considered like an authentic textbook, which it's not, right? 50% of it is just straight up contraindicated. Nobody should be doing that shit. And it's a book with that's there to make money. It's not scientific literature. It's not. But people were treating it as though that's where the information was coming from. So understanding where the industry was, that people were trying to use bodybuilding to improve athletic performance. This meme of train the movement, not the muscle, grew out of that. And what it did was it shifted us up the spectrum. So bodybuilding is primarily strength endurance. Now, bodybuilding does run the spectrum a little bit where you go a lot of endurance, strength endurance, a lot of hypertrophy, and also some power and some strength, or some absolute strength. Not really any power. Actually, bodybuilding is lacking power. So, what this meme did was it shifted the industry into more strength training and powerlifting type, train the movement like a compound movement, And it did yield better results. But we can do so much better. First of all, train the movement, not the muscle, is stupid. It's wrong in so many ways. You can't train any movement without training muscle. You can't move without muscle. So it's doublespeak. There's still people today. I was lecturing, and a co-lecturer literally gave a lecture on training movements, not muscle. And what they're trying to say is compound lifting, compound movements, lifting heavier weights spread across multiple joints and multiple muscle groups and transferring emphasis from one muscle group to another has more athletic transference than isolated joint training. And yes and no. Compound movements, higher weight, large movements, moving from large muscle groups and using multiple muscle groups to move large, heavy weights, falls under, right there in the center of our paradigm, absolute strength training, endurance, strength endurance, hypertrophy, absolute strength, explosive power. So it falls right here, and it goes up into close to explosive strength. And some people actually think, incorrectly, that it is explosive training. And it's not. You're just doing strength training with an emphasis on velocity, which it does move you up the spectrum, but it doesn't move you into the explosive spectrum. As an athlete, as a coach, I want you to be fucking greedy. Do we want strength endurance? Yes. Do we want absolute strength? Yes. Do we want explosive strength? Yes. All of it. We want all of it. Don't focus on one paradigm, knowingly or unknowingly. And most people that do it don't understand the full spectrum, don't understand the benefits, and don't understand the interrelationship, right? So people will stay here and train strength or train rapid strength, which is still strength, but it's transitioning to explosive, but it's still in the strength paradigm. And they think that they got it. They think that's good enough. And in a way, it is good enough, because if you just train strength, if you just train absolute strength and rapid strength production, so if you're doing powerlifting type movements, if you're just doing strength training, basic barbell strength training, the big lifts, deadlifts, squat, bench press, and some pulls and maybe some overhead pressing. If you just do that, the athletic transference is vast. It is good. And it is superior to what most other people in the industry are doing. So it seems like it's the shit. And it kind of is, but there's still more. And we can do better. So let's do better. The interrelationships of this spectrum and how the paradigms correlate is important. The lower paradigms build the foundation for the higher paradigms. So, just as I said, there's a lot of strength coaches that focus primarily in the absolute strength and rapid strength paradigm, there are some people that have figured out the stretch shortening cycle, the myototic reflex, the explosive paradigm, and focus predominantly there. And what you find with those coaches, they're great, they are great, and they get great results. However, they don't last. They don't last. This fighter does trains and then it drops off. The yields, the gains, the progress that they make drops off rapidly, almost as rapidly as it's gained. And it's because they don't have the proper foundation to be doing the explosive movements to yield the best benefits. What I'm saying, here we go. The best way to progress is start on the far end of the spectrum and progress through the entire spectrum over a period of time. It's called periodization. Not in one workout. You don't do, a 20 rep max of a movement and then do the plyometric version of that movement in one workout. Unless you're really, really good and you have a wonderfully trained athlete that is just so. For the most part, what I'm talking about is over a period, ideally of months, but realistically, we're talking weeks, right? Because who gets a fucking 4-month training camp? Nobody. But in a perfect world, you would run through the spectrum in about 3 months. And you would start here with a 20 rep max, single exercise, single set exercise, and then progress on up into heavier, slightly heavier, still low inertia, moderately heavy weights into the 8 to 12 repetition range where you're failing after 8 to 12 repetitions. And that pretty much describes the spectrum, the endurance spectrum, the useful endurance, strength endurance spectrum, because there is localized muscle endurance infinitely in that direction. And the limits of the spectrum of the paradigms of strength, the limiting factor is always injury, right? Take it to the extreme. Maximal force, maximal output, 2,000 pounds moved in a fraction of a second. What happens? Well, your joints explode. Go the other way, light repetition, infinite time, RSIs, calluses, blisters, joint degradation, inflammation. So injury is always the limitation. And the other thing that's important here, the one thing that all athletes have in common, athletes get injured because we are constantly pushing the boundaries and finding those limits. So by understanding the paradigms of strength, you can work strength endurance in joint isolated movements, in compound movements, which is completely opposite of that fucked up stupid meme, train movements, not muscle. No. Understand the paradigms of strength and train the muscles to go through the paradigms so that you get transference and superior athletic performance. Strength endurance, then absolute strength and rapid strength production. And this is where it gets interesting, because when you're dealing with weight training, resistance training, the 1 rep max seems like the end of the story. It seems like, well, it's 1 repetition and it's the maximum. We can't go any higher than that.
So that's not true. Your 1 rep max is not your maximal exertion, is not the maximal amount of force that your body can produce. It's not even close. But running from fewer than 8 repetitions on to 1 or less than 1 repetition. And then the explosive strength paradigm is where we yield the most benefit, but need to prepare the most for it by running through the other paradigms, and where most people, most coaches, most students don't get it. They don't have the understanding, but it's actually, the explosive paradigm is not best expressed in weightlifting terms. But you can train explosively with weights. And the force velocity curve starts getting relevant and confusing. The explosive strength paradigm is best represented with plyometrics. And instead of thinking in terms of repetitions and 1 rep maxes, or it's best to look at time under tension and always less than 8 seconds of work. Your fastest of your fast twitch motor units, that's what we're talking about with explosive strength training. And that paradigm, being the most important paradigm, is where most of your focus should lie as far as education and preparation, but not most of your work. Most of your work is getting the athlete ready to experience those high intensity, all in explosive workouts. And a really good, like, it's called complex training, where you're doing heavy lifting, explosive lifting, combined specifically with the matching plyometric movement with the appropriate amount of rest for neurological supercompensation to occur. So those, like a really solid, good, explosive strength training session, you might only get 1 a week because it's so intense, and that's all your schedule. That's it, right? Full body, boom, 1 done, 1 and done.
So the meme that was necessary to advance the industry out of the bodybuilding era, train the movement, not the muscle, is, think of it as a dysfunctional behavior, right? So you, as a person, you develop dysfunctional behaviors because at one point in your life it served you to get what you wanted, right? That's where all dysfunctional behavior comes from. It's a survival mechanism for a phase in your life where, but we're no longer in that phase. So get rid of it. Train movement, not muscle, it's so wrong. It's so stupid. It's so flawed. It's essentially Orwellian doublespeak. It's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. You train muscle. You train the neuromuscular system. You train the strength production systems. That's what it is. There is no movement training that's not muscular training, and there's no muscular training that doesn't require movement. Now, Brad, I know you're saying isometrics, but depending on how close you monitor, there's still movement occurring even with isometric contraction. So
all contraction, all force production, all training requires muscle and requires movement. So let's just throw that out. Some experts that I want y'all to start getting familiar with and start reading. First and foremost is Yuri Verkhoshansky, and he's got texts, well documented research. Right now there is, I think, the 6th edition of Super Training, the text. A little caveat with Super Training: the 3rd and 4th edition of Super Training were far superior to the current edition, which is, I think we're in the 6th rendition of it. The editor and Mel Siff, that's a person, Mel Siff. They have interjected some of Siff's work and some of the editor's opinion. And so if you get Super Training, read it carefully. For me, it's blatantly obvious what's Verkhoshansky, what's Mel Siff, and what's the editor's interjection. But it might be a little bit more difficult to sort. I knew Mel personally. I worked with him. What Mel was really good at was debunking fitness fallacies. But he didn't stay in his lane, and not so good with the athletic training, the auxiliary strength training that we need. So Yuri Verkhoshansky, check out his work, his literature. Another caveat: in order to even understand 90% of what he writes, you probably need a degree in exercise physiology. But hey, still worth looking at. If you're interested in learning about periodization, Tudor Bompa is who I recommend reading. I'm not totally convinced that you need to read up, the textbook on periodization. Periodization's a pretty simple concept, so what he managed to do is take something simple and make it extremely complex. Periodization in and of itself is a rabbit hole. It's worth going down, but how far down do you want to go? Tom Purvis, resistance training specialist programs, and he has a YouTube channel. I think it's personaltraining.com. There's going to be links to all these experts, obviously down below, for usable biomechanics, for exercise mechanics, for exercise analysis, for a foundational thought process of how to fit all these sciences together. Cannot do better than RTS, Resistance Training Specialist. So yeah, link to RTS and link to personaltraining.com down below. Oh, also, Dr. Yesus. Now, Dr. Yesus is a contributing author to Verkhoshansky's work. The difference, unlike Verkhoshansky and Mel, Yesus is still alive, and he's still doing work, and he's still working with people, and he even works with some combat athletes. So I will link to his YouTube page and also his website, because he's got some good stuff. All right, let's get back to that whole strength paradigm thing. And really, if you're still with me, cool. What the premise of this video is really to compare two thought processes, two concepts, two perspectives on program design and exercise selection. Hopefully that becomes more and more clear the more of this you see, but basically I am introducing you to, running you through the spectrum of the paradigms of strength and how they correlate and how to run through the spectrum to get optimal results versus where the industry is kind of at. They're kind of stuck in the absolute strength training paradigm with this catchphrase of train movement, not muscle. So it's not just to debunk, destroy, rip apart that retarded saying. It's really to help clarify a perspective in which you can fundamentally fall back on and know you're making the right choices in your program design. The other problem with train movement, not muscle, is that it leads to faulty exercise selection because you start thinking, oh, what movements do I want to strengthen? What movements? So that leads to a process of saying, this exercise looks a lot like that skill, so I'm going to do this exercise to improve that skill. And if we extrapolate out to the extreme, that thought process ends in simulation training, in taking the skill and adding resistance to it in hopes of improving the skill. And emphatically, simulation training does not work. It always deteriorates your skill. Don't do it, stay away from it. And scientific literature is overwhelmingly supporting that statement. You'll still find people, you'll even find devices. They had a javelin hooked to a pulley so that you threw the javelin and it resisted. Whoa. we just cited decades of research, peer-reviewed science saying adding resistance, because you never match the resistance profiles properly with simulation training. It's always a little bit off somewhere through the range of motion. It's too much resistance, too little resistance. Almost always what ends up happening is you slow down your skill, which is the exact opposite of why we are training. We're training to increase the force and velocity of our skill. So that thought process, that way of thinking, train movement, not muscle, at the extrapolation of that thought, the ultimate expression of that is simulation training. So if we don't go to that extreme, because most people don't go to that extreme. Most people know to stay away from simulation training, but they still fall into that trap of, well, this exercise looks like that skill, so I'm going to do this exercise in hope of generating some movement transfer and improving that skill. Movement is skill. Skill does not transfer. The paradigms of strength, transfers, physiology, adaptation, the physiological adaptation which yields strength is what improves athleticism, what improves athletic skill. It's the paradigms of strength that transfer, not movement, not skill. Movement is skill. So, let's walk through this. I know, like I said, it's a long video. The trap, the pitfall that people are getting stuck in. And if you were taught to think like this, don't feel bad. It's being taught. There are experts in this. Like I said, I've shared a stage with somebody that was lecturing 180 degrees opposite of what I was talking about. And so either you can say, know me well enough to know that I know what the fuck I'm talking about, or you can go back and spend 10 years reading the recommended reading list I just gave you and find out I know what the fuck I'm talking about. So anyway, all right. So we're in this thought process. We're in this way of thinking, train movement, not muscle. This movement looks like that movement, so I'm going to do this movement. I'm going to do this exercise to improve that exercise. So very, very, very common concept is a walking lunge. So a walking lunge looks a lot like a lot of athletic movements, right? So it looks like an exaggerated gait for walking, running. It looks like a level change for grappling, for wrestling, for MMA. So that movement, and then the skill of balancing to step through, that seems like it could be highly productive. But if you were listening, I just said the skill of balancing. And what do we know about skill? Skill does not transfer. So we, from the movement, not muscle perspective, look at the walking lunge. That's great movement. That movement looks a lot like our skill movement. But let's take that as one example and compare it to a squat. Good old barbell, good foot position, good knee tracking, good form, squat. Now, let's take those two examples of exercises and let's run them through the paradigms. First paradigm is strength endurance. First question, can you perform walking lunges with enough resistance to achieve a 20 rep max to failure on the extreme end of strength endurance, on up to, we'll call it 8 reps to failure on the heavy end. So on the light end, we're doing 20 reps. On the heavy end, we're doing 8 reps. So can you perform that exercise within those intensities? Yes, you can. Our job as coaches, our job as athletes, whether you are a striking coach, a grappling coach, a strength coach, a nutrition coach, or an athlete, all of your curriculum should first be examined and filtered and selected through a risk-benefit analysis. So, with the walking lunge, what are the risks? Where are the risks in a walking lunge? Well, when you swing through, if you misplace your foot, you risk a high ankle sprain. If you don't align your foot exactly right, you have knee tracking issues. If you lunge too far, have too much weight, too much inertia, too much momentum, you have subpatellar compression issues. So knee tracking, compression, and ankle sprain, these are all risks.
On the low end, low weight end of the spectrum, those risks are less. Getting towards the higher end, those risks start increasing. And if you're doing repetitions to failure, which I'm not saying always do, that is a variable that you can manipulate to yield the results that you want. But let's say that you are going in an 8 rep max and you're going to failure. Rep number 6, 7, and 8 are extremely high risk. Almost all injury is a result of fatigue. All injury is a result of weakness. Weakness comes from fatigue very often. So, understand, I'm not telling you do a squat, don't do a walking lunge. I'm walking you through a risk-benefit analysis with the goal of creating the desired physiological adaptation in the paradigm of strength that I want. Taking you through a process. I'm not saying do this and don't do that. But in this example, well, a walking lunge will work, and the last 2 or 3 reps get dicey. Is that acceptable risk? Depends. Depends on the athlete, depends on the circumstance, depends on the training, depends, right? I will say that as an auxiliary strength coach, if you are working with a fighter, minimize your risk every chance you get. The biggest mistake that happens is people try to prove that you need them. The strength coaches try to show how good they are, and then they overwork the athlete, and then the athlete gets injured in sparring, in wrestling, in mitt work. It gets out there in the skill. The skill gets compromised because our ego and our insecurity, we show up with the clipboard and show them our best work. Yeah. And then they get fucked up. A couple years ago, main events, fights, venues were getting canceled left and right because athletes were getting injured. Now, not only is that because of inappropriate exercise selection, that ego thing that I just talked about, everyone trying to show that they're the best in the world, throw drugs into that mix, and then throw real life into that mix. Boom. Okay. So, what to take away from that rant is if you are an auxiliary strength coach, if you're a strength coach, minimize your athlete's risk at every possible opportunity that you have. And talk to the other coaches as much as possible. I know it's really hard. It's really hard in our industry. And as a strength coach, chances are degrees, education, book knowledge, we're going to have the most of it. And you got to find a way not to disrupt, offend, shake the egos of the other coaches who are experts in what they do and not outside that. But the biggest problem in combat sports is that nobody talks to each other. The athletes don't talk to their coaches. The coaches don't talk to the other coaches. And in a perfect world, the strength coach or the explosivity expert, whatever we call ourselves, the auxiliary strength training coach, would set the schedule. In the perfect ideal world, where you get shipped off to the mountains and there's no external distractions, and all the food is right there made for you, and you got the gym here and the gym there, and in the perfect world, the strength coach sets the schedule for all the workouts. Doesn't design the mitt workout or the grappling workout or the sparring set, but
has control over the intensities because it's an accumulation of the day, right? Fantasies that I have. All right, so let's go back. Risk-benefit analysis. Can we perform a walking lunge within the strength endurance paradigm safely and effectively? I'm going to say yes, especially if you know mechanics and know what the risks are to watch for, and you can always stop before the maximal exertion, the point of failure where the risks fly off. Okay, so we can do that. Can you do it with a barbell squat? Yes. Does a barbell squat have fewer risks than a walking lunge? Yes. Because your feet set up properly and stay in that position, so your knee tracking is not an issue. Your high ankle sprains, not an issue. Patellar compression shouldn't be an issue, assuming that you have the setup properly and that you're not. Anyway, so you're not going too deep or going too far forward. I'm assuming you guys know that shit, but how to squat, that's another video. Or maybe actually check out Tom Purvis's videos, because why reinvent the wheel? You got the master doing it. Go check it out. I gave you the links already. So, a stationary barbell squat has less risk than a walking lunge. Which movement requires more skill? A walking lunge or a barbell squat? Walking lunge is a higher skill. Takes more coordination, more balance. Okay, so if we know that skill does not transfer, that means the lower the exercise skill, the better it is for our purposes. Now, side note, tangent, right? This is why I don't spend a lot of time with Olympic lifting. And Olympic lifting is phenomenal. It's awesome. It's incredible. And it is on the higher end of that absolute strength spectrum, and it even transfers explosive strength. However, most of to learn it right takes years. We ain't got that kind of time. There are physiological adaptations, there are joint structural compromises that are inappropriate, incongruent to fighting. If somebody is constantly trying to armbar me, Kimura, neck crank, then this shit, boom, is not. I don't want to give them that. I don't want to degrade that joint integrity further, assisting my opponent. And so not only is, I'm like, what's the through line here? The through line here is that skill is huge in Olympic lifting. So we want low skill, high transfer. Olympic lifting is high skill, high transfer, but it takes years to get to the point where you can do it proficiently in hopes of getting transfer. And most of the gains that happen are not strength gains, they're skill gains. And if they're skill gains, they don't transfer. So same thing happens with powerlifting to a much lesser degree. But what I'm saying is, if you're doing a 300-pound bench press and increase it to a 350-pound bench press, most of that is because your technique and your skill has gotten better. It's not necessarily that you've actually increased your absolute strength. Skill does not transfer. You might have heard me say that. All right, getting back to our example or our juxtaposition or comparison of walking lunge and barbell squat. Now, does everyone understand why we are comparing these two exercises apples to apples or kumquats to grapefruit. A walking lunge fits into the meme or the thinking that train movement, not muscle. Oh, that's great movement, and that movement looks a lot like other movements. Let's train that movement. And what I am showing you is that from the paradigm of strength perspective, from the actual athletic transference perspective, a squat most of the time is going to be superior until we get to the explosive stuff, the plyometrics. All right. So now we've compared in the strength endurance realm, right? And both exercises are appropriate. You just have to mitigate the risks more in the walking lunge than in the squat. Are you going to yield strength endurance? Yes, both exercises. Are you going to yield hypertrophy? Yes, both exercises. One has slightly more risk than the other. Okay, now, this is our strength endurance paradigm, spectrum paradigm, coming into absolute strength. Right here, I talk about hypertrophy training a lot, and it's kind of accurate, but it's kind of inaccurate also, because if you train, things hypertrophy. All exercise yields in muscular hypertrophy. It's just some total programs have a faster rate of atrophy than hypertrophy. All right, so like distance running or long endurance events still yield sarcomeric and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Just the atrophy is occurring at a higher rate because of protein breakdown and fuel system stuff. But right at that border, and there are no hard borders from one paradigm to the other, right? They all bleed into each other, and they are all interconnected and codependent, which is why I'm talking about this shit, right? Industry-wide, the trend and the mistake is to not even, because they don't understand, they don't do strength endurance training because they think it's bodybuilding. And yes, bodybuilding is predominantly strength endurance. However, rehab, prehab, corrective exercises all fall in this paradigm of strength endurance. Now, as we are moving up the spectrum from strength endurance to absolute strength, what happens is you get sarcomeric hypertrophy, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So there's the sarcoplasmic reticulum around the sarcomers. The sarcomers are the actual contractile protein, and the plasma around that is responsible for nutrient exchange, waste removal. It's very, very important. And all hypertrophy improves muscle mechanics. So somebody like Fat Country, Roy Nelson, a lot of his force is actually from his intramuscular fat that does not contract at all. It just improves the force angle of the tendons and the bones. So just being bigger, yes, bigger is stronger. But for a weight class sport, we want to make predominantly the hypertrophy to occur in the sarcomers, not so much the sarcoplasm. We want as much sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as necessary to support our higher functions, our higher velocity, higher force productions. And so it's, how much is too much, how much is enough? Well, that all depends on the individual. No one's exactly the same. Knowing about it and how to work with it, that's the strength coach's job. Coming up the spectrum, we are now, there's a sweet spot where you are getting less sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, maximal sarcomeric hypertrophy, and large strength gains. And I call it sixes. And the reason I call it sixes, because you are doing 6 repetitions of a 6 repetition max weight, which, let's talk about that. I don't subscribe to the school of thought of doing 1 rep max and then taking a percentage of that weight to determine your working loads. It's less accurate than what I do. If we're working with a 6 rep max, that weight's always going to be changing, but you know you found it because on number 6, you're at failure. So that's how I talk about intensity or weight or load or resistance, is in terms of repetition max, not percentage of one rep max. And some of you CS out there know what the fuck I'm talking about. Other people, I'm just talking gibberish, but come along with me. Hang in there. So, sixes. What constitutes a repetition? Well, it's different per exercise, per individual, per objective, goal. How deep do you squat? How far down do you bench? Well, if you know joint mechanics and you understand physiology, then you are setting the parameters per individual. So what constitutes a repetition? The parameters are set based on mechanics, joint structure and function, anatomical limitations first and foremost. Then, individual goals. How long is a repetition? Well, that depends also, right? So, if we're all the way down on the end of the usable aspect of the strength endurance paradigm, you could have a 2-minute repetition. You could be going through really slow at a pretty moderate weight. Hey, what if you have an isometric? Did I talk about isometrics? Isometrics, learn about them, integrate them, use them. I'm putting a link in the video below to an apparatus called Isophit. If you guys want to get out ahead of the industry, if you want to be on the forefront of corrective exercise, true corrective exercise, rehabilitation, rehab, and athletic training, and actual functional training, check out the Isophit and strongly consider putting it in your gym. So, how long is a repetition? Well, it depends. Here's the relationship. The further you are on the usable strength end, because on the endurance end, you can go infinitely, right? And much of it will not be useful at all, especially in combat sports. There is, all right, so this is a strength and power and explosivity game. The usable end of the strength endurance paradigm, lighter and slower and longer repetitions on up to the explosive, and the ultimate expression of the explosivity paradigm is your skill. Okay? Now, how long was that repetition? Hopefully it was 4 milliseconds, but probably longer than that.
But yeah, so we're ranging in the low end of the absolute strength paradigm. You're looking at 6-second repetitions. On the high end of the explosive, you're looking at less than 1 second for a repetition. And in the explosive paradigm, you're looking at milliseconds. Here's a note. Keep talking about that perfect world, right? Where you get to design the ultimate periodized program, and your athlete shows up every session and hits every workout, and recovery is optimal, and nutrition is perfect, and there's no outside influences. Yeah, right? So, that never happens. Never. Life always gets in the way of training. What happens very often, you're working with a fighter, a boxer, an MMA fighter, happens in boxing. Oh my God. I've been doing it for almost a decade. I still can't believe how much it happens in boxing. Okay, yeah, you have 8 weeks. Oh, no, wait, you only have 4 weeks. What? Guys, sign the contract and then pull out. It's really bad in MMA, but anyway, so you design the perfect program. Boom. Now you don't have time. Now you only have 3 weeks of actual work, right? Because on the week before the fight, you don't do any auxiliary strength training because that is taxing the system and taking away from the performance. So you want that cushion of recovery to focus primarily on strength and go time. So you only have 3 weeks. Now, you could just spend those 3 weeks in the explosivity paradigm. And assuming that your athlete is prepared for that, maybe that's an option. However, what am I saying? What I'm saying is bang for your buck, hypertrophy, strength gains, injury prevention. Sixes are where it's at, right? So if I have to cut out all the absolute strength training and all the strength endurance training, maybe I'll do some 6s and then get into the explosivity training. So we go back to our paradigm, and we're moving up from 6s, that transfer of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, sarcomeric hypertrophy, neuromuscular adaptation. So in the absolute strength paradigm, you reach a point where sarcomeric hypertrophy lessens and neurological hypertrophy increases, where the dendrites start to multiply and the activation capacity increases, and most of the adaptation is in the neural physiology, less than the muscular physiology. Again, physiology, it's happening everywhere, but towards the higher ends of the absolute strength paradigm, where you're getting into brief maximal tension, rapid strength production. These are some terms that, also this paradigm of absolute strength, some people refer to it as maximal strength. Tomato, whatever, let's go. Moving through that spectrum, bringing it back to our 2 examples. We have the walking lunge and the barbell squat. In the absolute strength paradigm, can you do high enough weight to increase absolute strength with a walking lunge? I'm going to say no. You cannot truly find a 1 rep max of a walking lunge. The limitation is going to be skill, balance, and risk. So at the higher ends of the absolute strength paradigm, you cannot even use this exercise at all. No, boom, gone. At the lower ends, the 6s, okay, the risks are exponentially greater. You're going to start running into joint problems that are going to show up 3 months from now. Still not an ideal exercise. Barbell squat runs through this paradigm, no problem. Actually, it's kind of the king of this paradigm. So, all right. And again, we're going back to train the movement, not muscle. Bullshit. No. Train in the paradigm of strength that is appropriate for the time to yield the results that you want and the physiological adaptations that we need. So that's where these exercises fall away, okay? Really can't do walking lunges with enough resistance to yield results in absolute strength. Okay. Barbell squat, yes. Now, what about the explosivity, the explosive strength paradigm, the higher intensity than 1 rep max? What are you talking about? Well, because it's explosive, the intensity is way high, but the duration is way low. And it's actually the duration that makes the walking lunge dangerous during the absolute strength phase. Because when we get to plyometrics, some of the best plyometrics are actually lunges. It's called bounding exercises. Go figure. Hops, jumps, bounding, rebounds, lateral bounding. So, and actually, there's limited squat exercises. There's the drop jump, the box jump, the jump squat. It's hard to do a plyometric jump squat, truly plyometric. Clearly, I know, I've already said that I need to put out a video on plyometrics because none of y'all are doing plyometrics right. Very few people understand what makes an exercise plyometrics versus what makes it ballistic versus what makes it just plain jump training. So on another day, we'll get there. Let's bring it back. Hopefully, y'all are seeing the way to choose your exercises is to understand the different paradigms of strength, how those paradigms correlate to the goals that we have, and then work your way through the lower intensity, strength endurance, right? So on the strength endurance end, it's where your rehab occurs, it's where your prehab occurs, it's where most of your injury prevention occurs, it's where your sarcoplasmic hypertrophy occurs, and it's where the sarcomeric hypertrophy starts to occur. And all of those things build a foundation that makes your athlete better prepared, hardier, less prone to injury to start the higher intensity, absolute strength training that is pretty high risk. Once you get into the absolute strength training, what happens is you start physiological adaptations, sarcomeric hypertrophy more than sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Then you shift into neurological adaptations. That's when you start being able to recruit higher amounts. Your activation capacity increases and your force production skyrockets. Then we get into speed, strength, strength, speed, explosivity, power, 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 power. The whole thing is you're starting here, coercing the gains into performing higher, stronger, higher, stronger, faster, 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 faster. That might be it. All right. Thank you.
Hey, guys, listen. We are making the world a better place. We're saving lives. Subscribe to my YouTube page. And if you're not on YouTube, if you're coming across this through another venue, Facebook, whatever, log in to YouTube and subscribe. Thank you.